I bet all of you that know me and have heard me before bet that I'm going to give a history lesson. You're right. You know, back on the wall here we have Wake Up America, and I believe that we could put just one more word in there: Wake Up Christian America. Christianity has gone to sleep, deep sleep, and consequently there's only a very few out there who are attempting to bring it back to the glory that it deserves and to the strength in Christ that we once had. And there's been so very much that has happened to Christianity since the middle of the 19th century. There are some theologians who even say that all that has happened is a part of the Christian experience. Some have said that the Christian evolution is in the true development of the human mind. Now, in my opinion, what they're doing is they're making excuses for what has happened. And they're trying to rationalize this evolutionary process of Christianity and say that it was God's doings in the first place. I personally would rather think of it as what we read in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. Now, we in the identity message, or the kingdom covenant message, if you would prefer that, we also read and understand another scripture, 2 Peter in chapter 1 and verse 15 and 16. I'm not going to ask you to turn to these because I've got quite a bit to give here in this 40 minutes, and this thing blows up, I understand, so we're going to have to really move along. In 2 Peter, first chapter, 15 and 16, we read this: Moreover, I will endeavor that ye may be able after my decease to have these things always in remembrance, for we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses to his majesty. Now, the problem is today, the established Judeo-Christian churches look at us as those described in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where Paul says they will not endure sound doctrine and shall be turned into fables. And they look at themselves, the denominational churches, as those described in 2 Peter 1, where Peter says, For we have not followed cunningly devised fables. Now, it is obvious that the one of the two groups of us is wrong. I would like to discuss one aspect of that difference of opinion, and then I will let you decide for yourself who has the better argument. How many of you have heard of or have seen a very recent publication by the National Council of Churches? It was written by Leonard Zeskin, Center for Democratic Renewal, and even the title of the organization is suspect. It is published by the Division of Church and Society of the National Council of Churches. In this, the title of it is The Christian Identity Movement, a Theological Justification for Racist and Anti-Semitic Violence. On page 21, he has a chapter, says the attack on the Judeo-Christian tradition and the mainstream churches. The identity attack has focused on several key issues. He includes several, and then he finishes with these two. He says, the open support that fundamentalists have displayed for the Jewish State of Israel and theological differences that exist between dispensational fundamentalism and identity. I would like to take this opportunity to have the, as Pete says, the informant who is here, go to Mr. Leonard Zeskin and also to the National Council of Churches, and I here would like to have Mr. Zeskin and the National Council of Churches refute the discussion that we will have in the next 40 minutes, 38 perhaps. I have titled my message, Christianity Since John Darby. There have been several key men who were extremely influential in the past century who have created a brand new religion out of old-time Christianity. Most of these men taught doctrines that are now generally described as Judeo-Christianity and Christian Zionism. This is a term you're going to hear now for this next period. But it was John Darby who was perhaps the most influential and who taught doctrines that made the words Christian Zionism even possible. Now, the purpose of this message today is to teach the history of this phenomenon so that you in turn can go forth and teach it to your neighbors and your friends. To me, this is a very, very important message because it tells you how Christianity got into the problem it's in today. John Darby lived from 1800 to 1882. He was a member of a group in England called the Plymouth Brethren. His contribution to the phenomenon that we now call Christian Zionism is in three parts. First, the singular Antichrist, part 1. Part 2, the Rapture doctrine. And part 3 is termed Dispensationalism. Now, all three of these are very familiar to you because each and every one of you have gone to churches who teach at least one and perhaps all three of these doctrines today. I would like to review the history of each of these briefly and then go on to show how these theories developed into the political and activist term Christian Zionism. It is just that, political and activist. And I'll show you that this is true in just a few moments. We have today the political and activist terms in the so-called Christian churches that teach liberation theology and sanctuary. Now, these teachings, in my mind, pale in comparison to that of Christian Zionism. And I don't think that we would have liberation theology nor the sanctuary movement if we did not have the teaching called Christian Zionism. Point 1 of Darby's 3 points. In 1585, a Spanish Jesuit priest named Francisco de Ribera, he wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation. He did this in direct contradiction to the teachings of Martin Luther and the other reformers at that time. It is thought by some that he did this cunningly to deceive the Protestants, because it was known at that time that 1/2 of the Roman Church left with Martin Luther. The Presbyterians in Holland and the Congregationalists in England broke with Rome. The early church in Glastonbury, and all of us here know that that very early church that Joseph Arimathea started just 8 to 10 years after the resurrection of Jesus was that church in England, and it became back into the central structure of the Reformation program. It was the centerpiece of the Reformation program. Now, incidentally, in my mind, because the church at Glastonbury was the centerpiece of the of the church at that time, at the start of the Reformation, in my mind, it was for that reason that Thomas Cromwell, in his purge of the 16th century, destroyed, one of the reasons that he destroyed the monastery at Glastonbury. The Jesuit priest Ribera, he taught that, one, in this singular Antichrist theory, he taught, one, that the Antichrist was a political ruler, one person who is yet to appear, and this ruler would rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He would restore animal sacrifices for the Jews, and he, this singular person, would rule for 3.5 years. And that point 3 in this theology, that he, the singular Antichrist, would rise to power in the last days and make a covenant with the Jews. So that was the first point of John Darby's message. The Reformation movement at that time, however, was sufficiently strong to withstand that teaching. Consequently, the theory went into obscurity until 1838, when a man by the name of Samuel Roffey Maitland, Dr. Samuel Roffey Maitland, who was the librarian for the Archbishop of the Church of Canterbury, he found this treatise written by de Ribera some 300 years earlier, and he published it. He published it far and wide, and our Mr. John Darby took it and he ran with it. He published it to all the evangelical societies of the day. The evangelicals, particularly here in the United States of America, took this, taught it, and they made it believable to the Christian churches of America. Prior to that time, there was no singular Antichrist in the United States churches. So we have point 1 of John Darby's message. Point 2 was that another Spanish Jesuit priest, Emmanuel Lacunza, he developed a theory on what we now know as the Rapture theory, and he developed this in the latter part of the 18th century, in the 1700s. This is the theory that Jesus will come twice, first for his saints to rapture them to be with him, then the second time for his judgment and rule. And again, this theory also was not accepted in the Protestant movement. Again, however, some years later, nearly 75 years later, Dr. Maitland took this theory and again reworked it with his singular Antichrist theory, and he published it in his own area, and again John Darby published the Rapture theory along with the first theory, and the evangelicals, again particularly in the United States of America, they ran with it, accepted it, preached it from all of the evangelical circuits that were of that day, and they made it believable to the American people. And it's intriguing to me that it was Samuel Maitland in both cases who resurrected these two ancient theories. And it was also intriguing and interesting to me that it was John Darby who took the works of Samuel Maitland and made them believable in the minds of the American churchgoer, American Christian. So we have point 2. Point 3 of John Darby's doctrine, which has forevermore modified Christianity, basic Christianity as we know it, into what we call the Judeo-Christianity or Judeo-Christian ethic, or Christian Zionism. The Plymouth Brethren, under the leadership of John Darby, they started teaching what is now known as premillennialist, dispensationalist premillennialism. Now those are pretty long two-bit words, which simply promotes the idea that the Jewish people must return to their homeland before the second advent can occur. Darby then married the dispensationalist theory to the singular Antichrist and the Rapture theories by stating this, that there would be a judging of all nations as well as the Jews during a great and terrible tribulation for 3.5 years. During this time, according to John Darby, there would be 144,000 Jews who would be converted to Christianity, and then after the tribulation, those good Christians who were raptured before the tribulation took place would return to the earth, and those 144,000 Jews and those Christians would rule the nations for the millennium and with Jesus. Now, that is the dispensationalist theory. It's predominant in many, many churches today. It's a centerpiece in many, many churches today. Now, these three theories were preached all over the Christian world. They became dogma in many churches. Now, you know and I know that almost everyone here has heard of these theories and have been taught at least one, if not all three of these theories. Certainly, Leonard Zeskin in his document shows that there has to be a debate between the dispensationalist theory and the identity movement. So that's the purpose of this message today. Incidentally, I had already prepared this message before I read the document from the National Council of Churches, so this is not in response to them, but I do believe it's quite timely. Now, how can we say that this became a political and an activist program? How can I tell you that this was one of the causes of the Civil War, the two world wars, all of the unrest in the Mideast today with the millions upon millions of people who have been killed and assassinated since World War II? All of the historical aspects of this. How could I tell you this if it was just me as an individual? It could be readily disputed. So, supposing we go to the Bible and we'll see what we'll use the works and the words of the Apostle John. What did he say in the first book of John in chapter 2 and 18 and 19? He said, "Little children, it is the last time. And as ye have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists. Whereby we know that it is the last time, they went out from us. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us. But they went out that they might be made manifest, or well known, that they were not all of us." So, with that in mind, I would like to quote from the Encyclopedia Judaica, 1971 issue, columns 1182, 1183, and 1184. 1971 Encyclopedia Judaica. You can find this article under the title Christian Zionism. So I would like to use their discussion on what Christian Zionism is and its political activist manifestations. And I quote, "As Zionism is understood to mean a modern Jewish movement aimed at resettlement in the land of Israel and revival of an independent Jewish nation, Christian Zionism, that is, the active support of Christians for such a movement, could not have preceded the Jewish forerunners of Zionism in the second half of the 19th century." I'll stop there just for a moment. You can readily see by that statement that they're not so smart either. They are readily telling us that they were actively pursuing the Zionist state along with John Darby. I will address this in just a little bit because I believe it to be very important to the message that I have today. So permit me to continue with this article. Now, also I want to state that because of the, in all of the readings, I do a lot of reading of their writings, and there's a different rhythm in their writing, and you'll notice this as you as you read their writing, and so it's a little bit dry in aspects, some aspects, and it's not kind of flamboyant like Brother Pete gives it and so forth. So they put a lot of commas in there and so forth. So it's a little dry, and forgive me for this, but you've got to understand this, because once you do, then you can understand why we in the kingdom message or in the identity message are considered the enemy by both the Judeo-Christians and the Jews alike. So it's important that you know this. Permit me to continue. However, Christian Zionism had a long prehistory, deeply rooted in theological thought and messianic expectations. Only gradually, with the emergence of Jewish political and settlement activities in Palestine, did Christian Zionism become more and more secular, pragmatic, and political, though we often still have the imprint of its religious traditions and motivations. Thus, even in the historic breakthrough of the Balfour Declaration issued by the British government in 1917, when political expediency was apparently the main factor, and I'll address that in a little moment, religious motives were certainly not absent from the thoughts of men like Lloyd George and Balfour. This is all out of this Encyclopedia Judaica now. This is their writing. The importance of the Christian and biblical traditions also became apparent in the attitude toward the State of Israel in the 1950s and 1960s. The attitude of the Christian world clearly became influenced by an undercurrent of intimacy derived from the biblical traditions. So what he is saying here is that they had the situation well in hand with both the political and the religious affairs in their favor. Now, it is not my purpose here today to discuss all of the geopolitical activities of Theodor Herzl, who is considered by many to be the founder of modern Jewish Zionism, international Zionism, in the late 1800s. However, we have all read about this, and we all know what took place as a result of Theodor Herzl's work with respect to World War I, the depressions in Germany between the two wars, and the depression here in the United States, and then the creation of World War II. We all have read what happened directly as a result, in part or in total, as a result of Theodor Herzl's work. So it's not my purpose here. But what about the Christian movement and thought during this same period? Now, I have stated in other messages that there is no possible way that 20 million people can control the destiny of nearly 1 billion Christians unless the Christians wanted it that way. That's just a fact of life. There's no possible way that the two can go together. Now that is what we are discussing today. How were Christians convinced that the Jews were to return to their ancient homeland, and then they would be the ones to teach the world about the kingdom here on earth? That's what we're going to study. Now, I will continue, if I may, with this article on Christian Zionism. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the article here rather quickly now. From the time of the Reformation, the belief that Jews should return to the Holy Land in accordance with biblical prophecies became popular mainly among pietistic Protestants and certain groups of English Puritans. Now, this morning we talked very warmingly of the Puritans, and justifiably so, because our heritage in the Puritan ethic is a tremendous heritage. But notice here it says certain English Puritans. Pietism means, by definition, those who seek to substitute devotionalism for the intellectual ideal in the Christian program. Now, what that definition means is that when you want to go to church, to go into that church to see the stained glass windows and the beautiful pews and the organ and the music, and have that as your desire for being in church more important to you than the message that you're supposed to get, you're going to get between 11 and 12 from the minister. When it becomes that important to you, then you are a pietistic person, and that is what pietism means. Now, what he meant by the certain groups of English Puritans refers directly to the organizations such as John Darby's Plymouth Brethren. So he's putting these together, the pietism and the certain groups of English Puritans were the forerunners, the ones who caused this phenomena to take place. The writer continues, it was based on the millenarian concept which held on the basis of a literal interpretation of apocalyptic prophecies that the second coming of Jesus was at hand, that he would rule from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. The millenarians anticipated not only the return of the Jews to their land, but also their conversion to Christianity as important conditions and signs of the times prior to the second coming or advent. Now, he continues, the restoration movement, now he's talking about, when he says restoration movement there, the restoring of Jerusalem, Palestine, for the Jews, spread from the 16th century England to other European countries, became particularly strong in the United States from the 18th century. It flooded the Protestant world with publications, sometimes with the restorationists requested heads of state to take political measures in order to obtain rights for the Jews to settle in the Holy Land. Now we're just now beginning to get into the political activism that I discussed that made the conditions that we now have in the world. Their activity remained without any practical results, however, until the 19th century, when essential changes took place in the character of the movement and in the motivations of Christians who supported the return of the Jews to the Holy Land. Now, at this point, the writer describes the Judeo-Christian, or the affairs and efforts of John Darby in much the same way that I did up in the beginning. He showed the three major theologies that John Darby preached, where they came from, and things of this nature. So he was right on. He showed this to be a very accurate statement. Now, we know that Dr. Maitland and John Darby were the center of the teachings of the entire movement that provided these essential changes that this Jewish writer is talking about. Now, these Jewish writers put all of this in writing, what's happened to Christianity. They put it there very boldly. All we have to do is read about it. They don't mind telling us. And I think that it is time that we start reading some of these documents that these people put in writing and publish for our review. All right, we're going to get in now to the truly political aspects of what this man was saying. He didn't mean to be saying this political aspect, but this is what he did. During the 19th century, Christian politicians in various countries attempted to act on behalf of the return of the Jews to the land of Israel, adding to their religious beliefs the political interests of their countries in the Near East. He brushed over that very lightly. An outstanding example was Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, Earl of Shaftesbury, who lived 1801 to 1885, who drew up detailed projects for the settlement of Jews in Palestine under British auspices, which he presented to the government and circulated among Protestant heads of state in Europe and in the United States. The Canadian theologian Henry Wentworth Monk visited Palestine and assisted the foundation of the first Jewish settlement in Palestine. The English mystic Lawrence Oliphant, who eventually settled in Palestine, lent aid to the first Jewish pioneers from Russia. He tried to intercede on their behalf in Constantinople. The activities of William H. Heckler is also recognized, and he was a very powerful figure in the same time frame. So we have Christians who were out there beating the bushes on Christian Zionism. The man then says the most famous of the Zionist millenarians in the United States was William Blackstone, who lived from 1841 to 1933. So we're coming up into our time frame. This they consider the most famous of all of the Christian Zionists. He is the author of Jesus is Coming, in which he expounded his belief in the future of the Jews in the land of Israel according to the dispensationalist conception. So again, you see, this man, William Blackstone, was taught by John Darby the dispensationalist theory. He believed it, and he preached it, and he stumped it on the streets, and he went down on Main Street and worked with it. He attempted a political realization of his ideas through memoranda to the President of the United States in 1891 and 1916, which demanded American intervention for the return of the Jews to the land of Israel as a solution to the Tsarist anti-Jewish persecutions. Hundreds of eminent Americans signed these petitions, which stimulated various reactions in the general and the Jewish press. Blackstone participated in several Zionist conventions in the United States, and he remained a supporter of the Zionist movement until his death. Now, that's the end of my quoting from the Encyclopedia Judaica. However, let me just add something now that this man didn't put in there, and you can readily see the political and the activist movements that took place. William Blackstone was a colleague of Mr. Schofield. And I'm sure that you all know who Mr. Schofield is. He's the one that wrote the Schofield Bible around the turn of the century. Mr. Schofield, in turn, was a friend of a man of the name of Samuel Untermeyer. Samuel Untermeyer was a very powerful figure in the United States because of his money and his position. And he had acquired information on President Wilson's indiscretions. And Schofield and Samuel Untermeyer, it was Samuel Untermeyer who actually did it, but it was Schofield in collaboration with Untermeyer, blackmailed Mr. Wilson into electing Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. He later became the Supreme Court Chief Justice. So now we are talking about Christian Zionism, and we're talking about political activism in Christian Zionism in the true light that it was intended, true light that they worked it. And this is important. So what we need to do now is to try to put this all together. What does it mean for us? I will very quickly discuss some of the pertinent points of the history of the Christian movement from the time of Christ. Each point is well documented, and so I'm not here to prove the points. I've done some in some other messages. I've proven some of the points in other messages. There's others that are so well proven, and so I just won't take the time to include the proof here, but it's there. Now we know that the Roman Church originated toward the close of the 2nd century from the works of a Simon Magus, and not that of the Apostle Peter. From the very start, the church incorporated pagan and heathen worship rituals until the time of Martin Luther. It was heavily infiltrated from the very start with the Antichrist. Some of them became popes. Now, Martin Luther came along, and he wanted a reformation of this. And he stated to his colleagues, I have come out a long ways, but I fear that I have not come out far enough. And he specifically did not deny any of the rituals, the pagan, the heathen rituals, unless they were specifically denied in the Bible. Martin Luther later in his life recognized this, and he repented for it before his death. The Reformation that Martin Luther started was then again heavily infiltrated by the Antichrist. This is history. We can prove it. Perhaps even more so than the infiltration that took place before the Reformation. The one point that the Roman Church doggedly hung on to was that of usury. Usury was forbidden, even in the Catholic Church, even though it was practiced in areas, even among some of the popes associated. Nevertheless, it was a forbidden practice because God says, thou shalt not commit usury. It was the Protestant movement who changed that. It was also the Protestants who allowed the formation of the Jews' battle axe, the Universal Freemasonry movement. And to this very day, the Freemasonry movement is an integral part of the Protestant movement. We must know these things. It's important. Now, none of this, though, would have provided a national homeland for the Jews, for which they could become a world superpower, to eventually control the destinies of all of the Christian people, all of the peoples on the face of the earth. To me, there had to be a program that would cause the most influential people on the face of the earth to destroy themselves. If the Christian people, which is basically the Western European Celto-Saxon, could be made to think of themselves as not being a part of this world, the problem would be over. It would be solved. Somehow, the idea of colonial rule, sure there was bad things about it, but the idea of colonial rule had to be destroyed. The idea of possessing the gates of the enemies had to be removed. Now, you know and I know that all of these things has happened. Give away the Panama Canal, we're giving away the Philippines, the Cape of Good Hope, on and on. The only way, in my opinion, that this could have happened, could have been accomplished, is through the modification of basic old-time Christianity. It was talked about this morning, those words, basic old-time Christianity. It had to be destroyed. The theological changes that took place, which created a national homeland for the Jews, was the teaching of John Darby and Dr. Maitland. To me, in my opinion, this one act, oh my goodness, that is that's all, folks. All of this has happened since 1948. Could not have happened without destroying the Christianity within. There's some more to this, but I'm sorry, it's over with. I'll continue tomorrow, though, God willing, and give the second barrel to this, because there's more to come. Thank you.